Supervisor Arnold?
Yep, I have a few questions and some other things I would like to see included too as we move this all forward. So I spent the weekend watching our hearing of February 28th and a little bit of the back in July 16, and it is funny how it's evolved into a more detailed conversation as we kind of think up things. So starting with that, back in February, we talked a lot about the status of the cannabis. Should it be treated as an agricultural crop? Should it be treated as something one-off? And I'm hoping that the words will, and what you especially talked to us about, Brandy, is it's kind of a, if we start to call that an agricultural crop, it will draw in a lot of other food crops into maybe some regulations that they don't have to comply with now, but it would, if it's all becomes under one umbrella. So I'm assuming that as we move this this forward, we're still, unless changed, we're still talking about this being not a one-off, at least a one-off where it has specific standards it has to comply with that other egg crops don't, correct?
That's correct. It is under the agricultural uses in our land use ordinance, but it's not specifically crop production and grazing.
So it won't affect some of the other food crops that are
That's correct. If we were to consider this crop production and grazing, we would be amending our ag element, which generally does not regulate crops.
So those are the key words. So then along those lines, I'm wondering, have we thought we have almost half of our county landmass under Williamson Act contracts? And which is a state program, so this shouldn't affect. In other words, if you have property that's under Williamson Act contract, the cultivation of cannabis should not affect. Are we going forward assuming that that is part of our ag program? At least it will fall under.
That's my understanding currently. There are some bills right now with the state regarding amendments to the Williamson Act program. I'm not sure if they address cannabis specifically, but the state is considering cannabis a crop, so it would apply for Williamson Act. It would be hard to qualify for Williamson Act solely on cannabis. Cannabis production, the amount of acreage you need to qualify, 10 acres irrigated, I think, would be hard at this point for one person with the limit on the 1 acre license.
Gotcha. And then again, along those egg crops. So right now, in this region, the Regional Water Quality Control Board has particular regulations that apply to any commercial crop that's irrigated. So, and it includes testing of, when we talked about water quantity and quality, it has more to do with water quality, but it requires, depending on what tier you're in, it requires, of course, runoff water testing for quality and making certain that the crop isn't contributing to degradation of the water quality running off, and also groundwater now where you have to test the wells. And I'm just wondering, have you heard, or maybe we talk about this, that might be something that as a commercial crop in this county that our regional water testing of the water quality around the crop would apply?
The Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board is establishing a permitting program for cannabis cultivation. They don't have that program set up quite yet. In the meantime, they do have a list of best management practices that they are expecting cultivators to follow until they get the permitting process up and going. Cannabis cultivators who obtain a land use permit from us would need to get that clearance from Water Board at the time of their business license.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask you, we heard a lot of talk about the caps on the numbers, and I'm just wondering, and I know we looked at a lot of other counties, and that will lead me to another question. We looked in a lot of other counties. So are the majority of the counties that you've looked into not capping, putting cap limits on their numbers of grows?
Monterey is the only county I've seen so far as cultivation. There are some jurisdictions that have limited the number of dispensaries, but Monterey so far is the only one that I've seen for cultivation.
Okay. And then when we were talking about the sites that registered, the folks that registered, And that was an ask we made last year, back in July, and we were asking people, we need a baseline, we need some help here, we have no idea how big this industry is planning on getting, what we need to do, where are you, help us figure out what our baseline is as we start forward with this ordinance. And people did, and I'm sure it was a little bit uncomfortable to come and start signing up. But do you know, what you mentioned our total was 400 and something.
455 applied for registration.
Okay.
And to date, 305 have been approved.
Okay, so you were taking those registrations and approving them. In other words, the criteria, if you have other, you had to be in an appropriate place before you got registered. So we have 305 registered sites that were legal, that are presently, I guess you could say, legally operating in the county.
93 have been denied, and there's 35 that have been provisionally approved.
And then that kind of leads me back into limits, or particularly paying attention to the criteria, because the one lesson I think we've all learned in these new industries, and the wine industry is a perfect example, so is the events industry, the tourism industry, the and all that. We've had problems with neighborhood conflict, and my goal would be to try to reduce that, or just conflict with what we're allowing in particular places. I'm looking at Dave, not just neighborhood conflict, but critter conflict too. So whether it's putting limits on or just building the criteria to try to avoid that. And I go back to California Valley, and I know because we have a lot of growers there, we're seeing a lot of interest there. But back in July, before we passed the urgency ordinance, we made it really clear. Some of us just wanted to just stop right now because we haven't agreed on where this is all appropriate. We allowed for growth to continue, and so now I know it's hard because I'm the last one that wants to take somebody's legal business down by creating a regulation that to the point they're not complying anymore. But we did talk about this back in July. California Valley finished this season, and then don't count on it. Nobody's grandfathered in, and we're going to move forward. So as we do that right now, I just want everyone to know, I hope before anyone invested out there or anywhere else, that they realize that we're kind of in the process of trying to sort this out. So anyway, the rest of my thoughts, I know delivery services are a big part of business, and the way that that product is sold and acquired today, and I don't think that is one thing I haven't heard about any conflicts with, is the delivery service as part of the distribution. So I would be really open to continuing that service. The undisturbed land, I think we heard Jamie talk about that, but that to me is not a criteria that we should put in as a lock solid deal. I'm sure we'll find as we lay the criteria we really want, zoning and acreage and license types and setbacks, I think that whether the land was undisturbed or not, I mean, we allow housing permits on undisturbed land. You just have to come in and make sure that you're doing it in an appropriate place. So I would want that to be not part of the criteria. Another thing about the water in all this discussion, if there was a requirement as part of our criteria that there was a residence, some kind of residence on a site that was partaking in cannabis cultivation, that would go a long way in helping us understand, because the criteria that allows you to, for example, California Valley, 7,000 lots, and most of them can't be built on because there isn't enough water to support a single-family residence. So in a way, that all goes hand in hand. If those resources aren't there for that, they'll be scarce for a lot of commercial cultivation as well. We talked about the hemp already. We talked about cleaning up California Valley, which Art's here, and I know we're talking about that. I think we just have to make a decision on as soon as we've concluded all this, there's a cleanup plan out there for California Valley. I talked about I talked about distribution, but I too would be in favor of dispensaries and industrial zoning. I'm curious about, as we move forward, so we're going to hand this off probably for the last time before we see it in its very final form. But where are we with our consultants? In July and February, we had discussions about how the consultants would be helping the staff get through all this and try to come up with a good product in the way of an
Mr.
ordinance.
Savage. Mr. Chair, Supervisor Arnold, Guy Savage, County Administrative Office. At this point, we've, well, let me start by saying that the consultant has reviewed every draft, including several interim drafts, as we've gone through this process. They have helped us look, they're beginning to help us look at some of the taxation and fee issues. To date, we've used, I'm estimating here, about $18,000 of the $25,000 your board authorized. We continue to engage them, and they continue to comment and provide various commentary to the drafts. Generally speaking, their discussion, I think appropriately so, has been, hey, in the trailer bill language, did you see that this thing has changed from how we talked about it last, that sort of thing, as opposed to trying to craft the specifics for how we might want to do things. Instead, they've been commenting kind of at a higher level to say,
Okay.
here's the industry, where it's shifting, you need to consider where it's going in the future.
Okay, and I'm asking just because I think we can use some help maybe going forward with some of this. On the 28th, we had Neil Hall here of SCI, and he actually gave a presentation that was helpful as we, so anyway, maybe in our next one, or hopefully they'll be available to planning commissioners as well. I don't think that...
If I may, yes.
Certainly.
So we can certainly make them available. I've just been a little mindful of the $25,000 cap that we put them on financially. I can certainly consider bringing back something additional just for SCI. Let me be clear about that. No other consultants. You know.
I'll see what my colleagues say
Okay,
about that.
all right.
I just noticed that was the difference between last hearing and this hearing is no consultant. The cultivation, I'm not so sure I would be in favor of any cultivation permitting in residential land use categories. I think it may be more appropriate in ag and rural lands categories. The mixed light considered outdoors, it seems to me, unless volatile manufacturing and industrial zoning and commercial service with a higher permit level. Well, last time we had a hearing on this, I hadn't gone out and really seen with my own eyes the volatile manufacturing operation. Now I have. When I went in there, I was really surprised. Hey, this is the same kind of stuff that's in like the welding shops. So I do agree that we have a lot of businesses that operate in industrial zoning and commercial service zoning that use exactly the same equipment. And then lastly, testing and commercial service and industrial zoning as well. If we have any businesses that want to come in as a testing business into the area. I was interested in the land use permit renewal. And, and then lastly, on the enforcement side. So I know I talked to Guy a little bit about this, but lots in our ordinance about our own enforcement guys going out and trying to keep this all straight. Lucky you, Art. But I also spoken to the sheriff, and the one thing that if we want to go beyond our own enforcement team trying to handle all this, that if we do have illegal activity, if we can do something with our ordinance where the sheriff is allowed under the circumstances, because I know in enforcement it takes a while. We have a completely different process when it's a little slower. But with the illegal activity going on, if the sheriff can remove plants, if some way we can put it into our ordinance, or I don't even know if we can do that. And also, if we can note that I think response time, our other lesson learned in California Valley that made it difficult and it created the ask for the urgency ordinance in the first place is the businesses coming in and the response time just being too far away. So if we can at least discuss some kind of criteria for cultivation activities, I would think would be the biggest in this, just because the other zoning is usually closer in, but that we take that into response time for law enforcement into consideration when we're creating our criteria for cultivation. And that's it for me.